Hi, everyone. Welcome to the event. Really excited to be live with you today. The goal today is to help you improve your data visualization game so that you and your team can become more effective at communicating insights and driving impact for your business. We'll talk about how people process information, the questions you should be asking before you tackle any data viz project, and we'll even walk you through our step-by-step dashboard design process with a case study that will drive all of this home for you. We'd like to make this event as interactive as possible, so please introduce yourself in the chat and include a quick sentence about what you're hoping to get out of today's session. We'll also be reserving some time at the end for Q&A, so feel free to ask any and all questions you have during this session. Put those in the chat, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can towards the end. While you're introducing yourselves, I'd like to welcome to the stage Chris Dutton, the founder of Maven Analytics. Chris spent years in business intelligence working for Fortune 500 companies. He is a best-selling course instructor who has taught over 1 million students, and he's built a corporate analytics training program that's used by companies like Crocs, Constant Contact, KPMG, Quest Diagnostics, and many more. There is no one better suited to help you and your team learn about data visualization today. Chris, welcome and take it away.
Awesome. You guys hear me all right? Perfect. Thank you, John, for the intro. Thank you to each and every one of you who decided to take time out of your day and join us to nerd out and talk data and data visualization. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. Really excited to share this session with everyone. We've got a lot to cover today. Like John mentioned, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why data visualization is so important and so powerful. We're going to share some of our best frameworks for designing effective visuals. We're going to talk about some do's and don'ts of data visualization. And then we're going to wrap things up with a quick case study to actually talk about how to apply these tips and techniques to a real world business scenario. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen and we can jump right into the presentation. All right, so here we go. So talking about data visualization, what we mean is really just bringing your data to life. Okay, so we're going to start with a 2-minute science lesson to talk about exactly why data visualization is so important. So we're going to kick things off by talking about the human brain. Now, as humans, we really aren't designed to interpret raw data. It's just not how we've evolved. So what we need are clear patterns. We need visual cues to help us quickly make sense of complex information. So when we perceive the world around us and when we try to make sense of all of the information and input and stimuli around us, we're putting different parts of our brain to work. So for instance, in the frontal lobe, you've got something called the prefrontal cortex. This is responsible for things like cognitive functioning and problem solving. It's where we do our slow and conscious thinking, and it helps us make sense of complex, non-visual information like raw data. In the back of your brain, in the occipital lobe, you have something called the visual cortex. And this is where it's responsible for visual perception, for understanding. This is where we do instantaneous and subconscious thinking, and it helps us make sense of things like colors, like patterns, shapes, relative sizes, and so on. Now, the beauty of data visualization is that it really plays to our strengths as humans, right? So it puts both our prefrontal and our visual cortex to work. And by doing that, it allows us to combine the power of cognition, which is slow and conscious, with perception, which is instantaneous. So that was a lot of words, a lot of science. There's another way that we like to talk about the power of data visualization as well. And that's using something called the 10-second test. So this is going to be an interactive exercise here. What I'm going to do is show you some data on the screen for 4 different products. And then I'm going to start a 10-second timer. And during those 10 seconds, your role or your task is to try to gather as much information about this data as you possibly can. Ready? Go. All right, time's up. So how did that feel? I assume it felt pretty quick, maybe a little stressful, maybe it provoked a little bit of anxiety. But in that brief 10-second window, go ahead and comment in the chat, shout out any information that you were able to glean, anything you're able to capture from that quick snapshot into that data. Let's see, we've got some comments coming in. Maybe you noticed that product A was increasing. Maybe you noticed there was a dip here and there. Okay. Perfect. So Matt says he wants to throw it into a data visualization tool to look for patterns. That's right. So that's exactly what we're going to do now. So now what I'm going to do is show you the exact same data points on the screen, except we're going to visualize it. Okay, same thing. I'm going to show the data, launch that 10-second timer, and I want to go through the same exercise. Try to gather as much information as you can in that 10-second window. Ready? Here we go. Time's up. All right, how did it feel that time? Right, we're actually looking at all of the same information, all of the same data points that I showed on the screen just a few minutes ago, except this time we're not looking at raw data points. We're looking at this information visualized. And now by presenting it this way, again, we're putting that visual cortex to work, and very, very quickly we can identify patterns like the fact that product A is on a steady increase with a large dip in month 6. We see that kind of upward trend for product B. Looks like product C was pretty flat most of the year, but then saw a very sharp increase in months 11 and 12. Looks like product D follows a seasonal or quarterly pattern or trend there. All of that information we're able to glean in that same 10-second chunk, but it felt much easier to gather that information once we visualized it instead of trying to interpret those raw data points. So for anyone who's interested in kind of this demo here, this is actually a variation of something called Anscombe's quartet. And what's interesting is that all 4 of these series actually share the same mean and very similar descriptive statistics, but obviously they each tell a very, very different story once you visualize it. So that's a great way to capture why data visualization is so important and why it's so powerful, especially in this field of data analytics. So let's shift gears here and talk about best practices for designing visuals. And anytime you're faced with a data visualization project or exercise, whether it's an ad hoc analysis or a performance report, KPI dashboard, there are 3 very important questions to answer to help you come up with an effective visual. The first question is, what type of data are you working with? So are you dealing with geospatial information where mapping will be important? Are you dealing with time series data, looking at patterns over time? Do you have natural hierarchies? Are you dealing with specialized data like financial information? Understanding the type of data at hand is the first step for understanding what type of visualization to use. From there, the second step is thinking about exactly what you want to communicate. So what are you trying to show or communicate here? Is it comparison between series? Is it the composition of a whole, the relationship between fields, distribution of numerical values? Knowing exactly what you want to communicate will help you choose the most effective chart type. And the third question, arguably the most important, and in my experience, the one that most people skip, is understanding who the end user is and exactly what they need. So the way you design a visual or the way you approach a data visualization project for an analyst will look and feel very different from a data visualization project for a manager or an executive company. So let's go ahead and unpack each of these a little bit more in detail here, starting with this first question. So what type of data are you working with? And here are some examples, right? You may have time series data where you're going to want to show trending over time. You may have geospatial data. You may be looking at categorical information where comparisons between categories are very important. You might have hierarchical data like product categories and products. or maybe you're working with more unique or specialized data sets like financial data, text data or survey results, funnel data, or surveys. So again, the type of data that you're working with will often determine which type of visual best represents it. So for example, the obvious example is using maps to represent geospatial data. We recommend using line charts for time series data, tree maps for hierarchical data, and so on. So that's question one. Let's drill into question two here. Again, what do you want to communicate? And when we break down kind of the larger world of data visualization, there are really four different types of communication here. You can show a comparison, a composition, a distribution, or a relationship. So comparisons, this is all about comparing values over time or across categories. And common visuals that are often used to visualize comparisons are things like column and bar charts, clustered bars or columns, line or area charts when you're dealing with time series data, or funnel charts if you're dealing with sequential stages. Looking at compositions, this is all about breaking down the component parts of a whole. So for compositions, common chart types that you'll see and use are stacked bar or column charts, pies or donuts, stacked areas for time series data, tree maps or sunburst for hierarchies, and maps for geospatial composition as well. Looking at distribution, this is all about showing the frequency of values within a series. So by far the most common visuals you see to show distributions are histograms and density plots. You can also use tools like box and whisker plots, violin plots, or data tables and heat maps. And last but not least here, if you want to show the relationship or correlation between multiple variables, scatter plots and bubble charts are the most common way to do that. You can also use data tables, heat maps, correlation matrices, or even line charts to show relationships over time. So the bottom line here is that it can feel a little bit overwhelming because there are hundreds of different chart types out there, but keep in mind that most of them are either serving very specialized purposes like stock charts or waterfall charts, decomposition trees, or they're simply variations of these core charts like bars, columns, lines, and pies. So let's jump to question number 3. Who is the end user and what do they need? So we're going to break it down here and kind of simplify it down to 3 different personas or stakeholders who might be consuming a data visualization report or project. So if the analyst is your end user here, if they're the stakeholder who's going to be viewing and interpreting the analysis or the visualization that you're producing, typically this type of audience is going to want to see details, right? They're analytical. They're going to want to understand exactly what's happening at a very granular level. So for these types of audiences, it often makes sense to use tables, combo charts, granular details so that the end user, the analyst, can conduct some root cause analysis. They like being in the weeds. So those types of complex visuals or granular visuals are likely appropriate for that audience. On the other hand, if you're presenting to a manager, for instance, they'll typically want to see more summarized data, right? And ultimately, they want clear, actionable insights that are going to help them operate the business. So when you're designing a visual or report for this audience, you should focus on common, intuitive chart and graph types, include some detail, but only when it supports a specific insight. And then all the way on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the executive. This is your CEO, your CMO, your board member. And these audiences typically need very, very high level, crystal clear KPIs because it's all about tracking business health and top line performance. So when you're designing visuals for this audience, it's really important to stick with things like very simple KPI cards, simple charts, minimal detail, unless it's adding critical context to those KPIs. So bottom line here, how you visualize and present your data really is a function of who will be consuming it and what they need. So again, a fellow analyst may want to see those granular details. On the other hand, managers and executives again, often prefer those top-line KPIs so that they can come up with these clear data-driven insights. So those are the 3 key questions. The next topic that I want to talk about, which is very important, is context. So when you're presenting or visualizing data, it's extremely important to remember that context is key, because context is what gives numbers meaning. And context is what helps users interpret these values and these metrics accurately. So an example that we often use to draw a parallel to everyday life is, imagine you walk into the doctor's office to get a blood test, right? And they draw the blood, they run the results. Doctor comes back in the room and he says, "Chris, your iron level is a 62," and then just walks out of the room. How am I supposed to react to that, right? I don't know if an iron level of 62, which I just totally made up, by the way, is good. I don't know if it's bad. I don't know what my iron level was last week or last year or what it even should be. And that's a really good example of a number being presented or shared without context. And the same holds true in the data analytics and business intelligence world. So imagine someone presents a report to you and they share this KPI and they say, "Hey, for October, we had 690 unit sales." Same takeaway here. Is that good? Is that bad? How am I supposed to react without context? Now suppose they share the report, except it looks like this. Now, instead of just sharing the number on its own without context, we're adding some valuable information here as well. We're showing that unit sale performance compared to last month, compared to last year, against our internal targets or benchmark. We're visualizing that data to show the trend or pattern over time. We're using color and highlighting to highlight high and low points over the course of the year. And we're not only showing performance trending for this year, but we're showing how that pattern compared against the trend in the previous year as well. So just by adding these pieces of valuable context, we're able to come to a number of different conclusions about that unit sales figure, right? Now, of course, we know we drove 690 sales in October, but now we also know that that's down 4% compared to last month, but up 9% year over year. We now know that we exceeded our target in September and October after falling short in August. We know that we're seeing a general upward trend this year with a significant peak in July. And based on seasonality, we know that we can expect a strong November, December as well. So much more information, such a richer analysis, just by adding these pieces of context around the KPI number itself. All right, so with that, let's talk about a few common data viz mistakes. I'm going to share 4 of them here. These are mistakes that we see quite often and ones that are actually pretty easily avoidable once you get a handle on the best practices. So mistake number 1 is choosing the wrong chart type for the data. Here's a good example that we see all the time. In this case, we're using a line chart to visualize categorical data. And the problem here is that we're creating a story that doesn't actually exist. A user is going to look at a line chart and think pattern and trend and see this as something that's going up and then dropping and coming back up. Realistically, all we're trying to show is a categorical comparison between these 4 different series: chicken, beef, pork, and fish. So in this case, using a bar or column chart like you see here is a much more appropriate chart type to visualize this type of data. Another very common data viz mistake that we see is showing too many series in a single visual. So how many people have seen line charts like this? Got something like 12 or 15 different series that are represented here. And it's just so busy and overwhelming that it's impossible to understand what the pattern or finding is here. So a couple interesting ways that you can handle this. One way is to highlight dynamically the series that you want users to focus on. In this case, just bakery, goods versus beef. Another example that we often see is a pie chart, just like our line chart here that's showing way too many series. In a case like this, what you can do is simply group different categories to focus on certain comparisons within that composition. Another common data viz mistake that we see is failing to provide meaningful context or clear labels. So here's one example. Not really clear what's going on with the x-axis or the y-axis here. We don't know what these values represent, what each period on the x-axis represents, or even what the 4 lines or series represent. So using data labels, using clear axis labels can really help just tell that story much more clearly and avoid confusion. And then finally, number 4, using inconsistent colors between related visuals. We'll talk about the importance of color in just a minute. But here's a good example. You've got 2 related visuals here with a pie chart or donut chart showing composition and a bar chart where the colors are mismatched, which is just extremely confusing. So using the same colors consistently here is very effective and allows you to do things like actually remove elements like the legend and still let your users understand the charts that they're seeing. I see this comment about pie charts. I would like to do we can do a separate deep dive conversation into pies and donuts at some point. Definitely a hot topic right there. All right, so at this point, we've been talking primarily about general data viz advice and specific kind of individual visuals. Let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about analytics dashboards. So the way that we define a dashboard is it's an analytics tool that's designed to consolidate data from multiple sources, allow users to track key metrics at a glance, and most importantly, facilitate data-driven decision-making. So here's a good example for you. Suppose that your business has product data, you've got revenue data from the financial team, you've got log-level transactional records, and maybe some customer data from your CRM system as well. A dashboard is what can create that centralized source, that user-facing dashboard that integrates all that information together, again, to facilitate data-driven decision-making. So what I want to share with you now is our 6-step framework for dashboard design. And this is the same framework that we use every time that we're approaching a dashboard project for any audience. You can follow these 6 steps, and it's really going to make you focus on using data visualization best practices, telling a clear story, and ultimately driving to the business outcomes that really matter. So the first step in this framework is about defining the purpose. And I can't tell you how many people skip this step and just start designing and start visualizing their data. That's a dangerous move. Always make sure you're stepping back and thinking about the intended outcome and the purpose itself. So dashboards can be built for a number of different reasons. They can be built to serve many different purposes. Could be executive level reporting, performance deep dives, exploratory analysis, infographic style storytelling. There's really no right or wrong, but what's important is that you design your dashboard as a function of the purpose that it will serve and the audience that it will be serving. So the key questions to consider at this stage in the framework: who are those end users consuming the dashboard? What are their key business goals and objectives? In other words, what are they trying to get out of this visual? What are the most important questions they need answers to? And how frequently will the dashboard be reviewed? So those questions are going to help us clearly define the purpose. Next up is choosing the right metrics. So once you define that purpose, it's important to identify which metrics and KPIs to include. So goal here is to focus on the metrics which directly align with those key business goals and which also consider the level of detail that's most appropriate for your audience. Again, whether it's an analyst, a manager, an executive level stakeholder, and so on. So the key questions to consider here: number 1, which metrics accurately measure each of your business goals, and what level of detail is appropriate for each metric. Little pro tip here, this is a common mistake that we've seen quite a bit, is that you might be tempted to include everything in your dashboard. You've got product data, you've got transaction data, you've got CRM data with customer demographics. Most people will be tempted to just shove all of that information into the dashboard. But you have to remember that in many cases, especially with dashboard design in a BI context, less is often more. So it's really critical to focus only on the metrics that matter and to eliminate anything that's not serving that purpose or not adding direct value. Third step here is presenting that data effectively. So now you know the purpose, now you know the right metrics that are supporting your business goals. The next step is to communicate that information quickly and clearly. So at this stage, it's all about using charts and visuals that are suited to the type of data you're working with, the story you're communicating, and the end user consuming the information. Again, those three key questions. And a little tip here, if you want to allow for some exploratory analysis, this is where you can think about adding filters and interactivity to allow users to explore the data a bit on their own, answer new questions, discover fresh insights. And pro tip here, again, very common mistake people see is that oftentimes people will choose to prioritize variety over effectiveness. So in other words, they'll say, okay, I've got this tall, narrow space in my dashboard that I want to fill. Even though a column chart would be the clearest way to show this, I'm going to use this radial chart or this decomposition tree or something fancy just for the sake of adding visual variety. There is a time and place to focus on design, but generally speaking, as a best practice, it's always most important to choose the right chart for the job and the chart type that tells the story most clearly. Step number 4, so this is an important one. It's all about eliminating clutter and noise. When it comes to dashboard design, real estate is precious. So like I just mentioned, it's important to cut anything that's taking up space and not adding value. You have to be a little bit ruthless about this, and it's tough. But things like 3D formats, like extra chart borders or labels, excessive colors, background images, a lot of these features end up only distracting users from the story and the insights that matter and the ones that you're trying to clearly communicate. So our takeaway here is that clarity always trumps aesthetics when it comes to dashboard design. And this is one of my favorite quotes, typically used in the context of design or UX, but I think it applies quite well here as well, which is that perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. So definitely good word of wisdom when you're designing your dashboards. All right, on to step 5, using layout to focus attention. So a good layout is going to feature the most important information, the most important insights and trends up front where viewers are most likely to see them. And then they're going to guide the viewer through a logical story. Okay, so you don't want to just throw information on the page and expect users to connect these dots on their own. So a few really powerful tips here when it comes to layout and attention are using pre-attentive attributes, so things like size, color, and position to highlight key data points or specific patterns that you want to communicate. Gestalt principles, so things like proximity, enclosure, and connection to group related visual elements can be very, very powerful. And last but not least, consider common reading patterns like Z patterns or F patterns when designing your dashboard layout. So a couple examples of that. An F pattern kind of shows that users start in the top left corner of the page, then move to the right, then back to the left, back to the right. Very similar with the Z pattern. And then we see kind of these most attracting areas on the bottom right, almost like a heat map of where viewers tend to view. So bottom line here, kind of key takeaway is to put the most critical, the most important information where viewers are most likely to see it. And here, at least in Western cultures, top left corner is really that key hotspot. Last step here is telling a clear story. So remember, human beings were not inspired by facts and figures. We're not inspired by numbers or charts or graphs. We're inspired by stories and by storytellers. So the most effective BI dashboards are the ones that use data to drive real-world business outcomes by telling clear data-driven stories that are designed to show key insights and, here's the key point, inspire stakeholders to act. Because when you stop and think about it, if your dashboard or report doesn't inspire action, if it doesn't facilitate any change in the business, what purpose does it serve, right? So pro tip here, when it comes to telling a story, some people are afraid to add text to the dashboard. They think that they can only use charts and data points, but realistically, using text strategically and sparingly can be really valuable, right? Using things like descriptive titles and data labels can actually be a really nice way to create a narrative and guide users through your dashboard. So that is our 6-step dashboard design process. Still a little bit kind of high level at this point. So to drive it home, what I'd like to do is walk through a very quick case study. This is actually taken from our advanced Excel dashboard design course. We're going to talk about Maven Toys. So here's the situation. You've just been hired as a lead business intelligence analyst for Maven Toys. It's a nationwide chain of toy stores, and your assignment is to design a dashboard specifically for regional sales managers to help them track revenue trends by region. So they're going to review this dashboard once a month, and they need information on sales trends, on product performance, and on lost revenue due to inventory shortages. All right. So our objectives here, basically walk through that 6-step workflow to define the purpose, choose the right metrics, present our data effectively, eliminate clutter and noise, use layout to focus attention, and finally wrap it up by telling a clear story. So let's walk through each of these steps. I'm going to do this kind of quickly, but we'll start with defining the purpose. Again, these are those key questions that we're going to try to answer. Who are the end users? These are our regional sales managers. What are their key business goals and objectives? Well, they want to increase revenue. They want to minimize revenue loss due to lack of inventory. What types of questions do they need answers to? Well, put yourself in the shoes of one of these regional sales managers. They're going to want to understand, is revenue going up or down? What are the main revenue drivers? Are we missing products in stock? Is that causing us to lose revenue? And then last but not least, how frequently will the dashboard be reviewed? Once a month. Okay, so at this point, we've answered these questions, and that's allowed us to define a clear purpose for this dashboard. Step 1, done. Now let's move on to step 2, choosing the right metrics. This is a nice little framework that we often use to come up with the right metrics and level of detail for a given dashboard. So you can see these 2 primary business goals here on the left side of the slide: increase revenue and minimize revenue loss due to lack of inventory. And basically, you can go through an exercise like this and think about which metrics help support or inform each of those business goals. So the business goal for increasing revenue, types of metrics that can help inform that goal might be our total revenue, maybe revenue month over month, percent change, year over year change. And then in terms of minimizing revenue loss due to lack of inventory, metrics like how much stock we have on hand for certain products and estimated monthly revenue loss will be important metrics to help inform that business goal. And then you can go through a very similar exercise and think about what level of detail is most appropriate for each of these metrics in order to answer the questions that our key stakeholders need answers to. So this is step 2. We now understand the purpose. Now we have some metrics that are going to help us address these business goals. Step 3, remember, is all about presenting these metrics and this data effectively. So here we've got a list of all of those metrics and levels of detail that we defined in step 2. And now all we're going to do is go through metric by metric and think about what's the most effective visual type to use here. So in this case, we're going to use a lot of very basic, highly simple but effective visuals like line charts, some KPI cards, bar charts, tables. And then because we want to make this interactive, we're going to add some filters here for month and region. Now I'm going to pause here for a minute because it's important to note that this process that we're going through, steps 1 through 3, this is a very challenging process, right? And it's an evolving, iterative process. Don't expect to just come up with an exhaustive list of metrics and visuals like this off the top of your head. Um, Generally speaking, you're going to take a stab at it, you're going to draft it out, you're going to start to see how the dashboard is coming together, maybe then realize that there are other metrics that might be valuable, start to visualize those. So don't want to oversimplify it or make it seem overly simple here, because it really is a complicated exercise and it does take time to iterate to get to the end result that you really need. So at this point, we've worked through our first 3 steps. The fourth is actually putting this information down into the dashboard. Okay, so we've got the visuals, we've got the metrics, we've dumped it onto our report canvas here. And now let's talk about step 4, which was eliminating clutter and noise. So looking at the visuals here, it's a little overwhelming, right? You've got chart outlines, you've got a bunch of extra labels, you've got kind of busy chart axes, bunch of tables that don't really draw attention to any particular patterns. So by eliminating clutter and noise, we can clarify this view quite a bit, like so. So I'm going to do this kind of pre-post one more time. This is before, this is after. So you've noticed we've gotten rid of things like grid lines, extra labels, chart borders, table borders, things like that. And it's really just cleaned up and polished the view and made it much more easier to focus on the metrics and the information that really matters. So step 4 was about eliminating clutter. Now let's talk about using layout to focus attention. So I'm going to transform this one more time. This is our starting point. And this is how we might use layout in a little bit more of a strategic way to help focus attention. So I'll go back and show that pre-post one more time. Here's the pre, and here's the post. And notice some of the differences here. We've put the dashboard title and theme right there in the top left to make it very clear what we're looking at. This is a regional sales dashboard for September 2021. And then as we look down into this dashboard, we see that big KPI card, that $50,618 in monthly revenue, right there drawing our attention. We're adding context with month over month, with year over year. We're showing that trending total revenue for this year compared to last year. We're using Gestalt principles to kind of group those related revenue visuals together right there on the left side of our dashboard. And then as we move, as we kind of view to the right, we start to see the product category performance, right? We start to see products that have no stock where we're losing revenue. And then down in the bottom, we see kind of the most granular part of our dashboard, which is the actual product level drivers. So which products are driving the increases in revenue, which products are driving the decreases each month. So that's step 5, using layout to focus attention. Final step 6 here is telling a story. So one more pre-post. This is our pre. This is our post. So like we talked about, using text thoughtfully here, it can really have a big impact. So now even impacting the dashboard title, we're framing it as how did the region perform in September 2021? And you can actually read through this dashboard and follow the narrative that we're creating here and note how smoothly and naturally it flows. So this is how much revenue we generated. This is the trend in 2021 versus 2020. This is the revenue split by product category. We're losing sales here, and these 5 products drove the increases and decreases. So we're using very descriptive headers and chart titles. We're using these pre-attentive attributes like color to kind of tie into the color schemes that we're using and to draw attention to positive and negative trends using green and red. And now it's not just information and charts that we're throwing at the user, expecting them to connect the dots. We, as the analysts and the report creators, are connecting the dots for them. And again, telling that very clear story and narrative to derive the insights that really matter to our audience. So that's the case study here. Hopefully that was helpful to see an actual tangible real world example of how you can put this framework to use. Last thing we're going to do here is cover off on key takeaways to kind of wrap up the presentation. Number one, remember anytime you're facing a data visualization project, start by answering the 3 key questions. What type of data are you working with? What do you want to communicate? And who is the end user? Always try to keep it simple by eliminating noise and distractions. I'm going to pull up this quote one more time. Perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. Really focus on telling a story by focusing the viewer's attention. Use pre-attentive attributes, gestalt principles, and thoughtful layouts to create a clear narrative. And last but not least, remember that context is key, because context is what makes the data mean something, and it's what helps users interpret it accurately. So that's all I've got. Thank you all very much, and I believe we're going to keep a little bit of time for open Q&A. So if there's anything else that I can help answer, go ahead and fire it off in the chat.
Chris, that was fantastic. Yeah. So next up, we're going to get to Q&A. So first, Kavita had, why should we care about how frequently a report will be used? What impact does that question have when we're creating the dashboard? So Chris, do you want to take that one or you want me?
I can start. I think one of the big reasons why that's important is to determine the right granularity of data to include. So if this is a report or dashboard that's being presented monthly or quarterly, it probably doesn't make sense to have transaction level or hourly level data presented. And it can also help you kind of tie the report back to the business objective or outcome at hand. So for instance, a monthly report, the primary goal may be to inform strategy or direct strategy for the next month's budget, right? Or a quarterly report might be used to help inform the strategy to set goals or benchmarks for the next quarter. So understanding the frequency or the cadence of a report can help you better understand the intended outcome or business goal. And again, also the specific type of data and granularity of data that you're going to include. Anything to add to that, John?
No, I think that's perfect. I think you covered all the points that I was going to hit on that one. So well done. Next, we've got Matt, who he says, do you suggest a peer review before presenting your dashboard to end users? I can quickly touch on this one. If that's an option for you, obviously that's great. And yes, definitely, it's always great to have a second set of eyes, somebody who may be considering blind spots that you're forgetting. And what I would recommend is, maybe you have that person at work, which is fantastic. If you could kind of buddy up with someone, do that, offer to do it for them, they'll do it for you. That's a great pair. If you don't, you could potentially find somebody in the data community who's willing to do this. I know a number of people who are Maven people who have met other folks on LinkedIn. That the data community is like a really welcoming place. If you see somebody who you see is active and you might get along with, see if that's kind of a resource that they'd be interested in having themselves. It's really a win-win partnership. And then even kind of short of, if you actually have that other person, kind of taking a step back from the work when you think it's done and trying to ask those questions yourself as if you were another person, that could be a little bit harder, but I still think that step is really valuable. So that's what I would say on that one. So absolutely, yes, go for that. Any other questions we have here? Should we talk about why pie charts are awesome?
I saw Matt's comment about the pie chart, and I had a feeling that was going to come up, because anytime the pie chart or donut chart topic appears in a data viz conversation, it tends to be a bit polarizing. We have some posts about that, actually. I'm on the, I don't know if I want to say the pro pie chart side, because that's a little extreme, but I am okay with the use of pie charts when they're used strategically. And I think the reason pie charts get a bad rep is because a lot of people misuse them. And they misuse them by including way too many slices where it's impossible for the human brain to identify differences in angles, right? They misuse them by not sorting the data clearly, by not categorizing the data in a meaningful way. I think when used properly with 2 to 4 segments max, I do think they can be an effective tool, an effective visual to use. I think the problem is just most people don't use them effectively, and that's why people get really fired up about pie charts in general. But that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say, show me a pie chart that's more complicated than maybe 3 or 4 values in there, and I'll turn it into a bar chart that's ordered in a logical way, and it will be tremendously improved every time. So that's what I would always say. That I think you could even argue that for one with 3 or 4, but I think it's 3 or 4, it still works. Your brain can process it well, but anything more than that, and it's an absolute mess. You're not communicating anything. So, any other last questions before we cut off the feed here? All right. Well, seems like it's it. Looks like we got a little over maybe 35 people at our peak. So thank you guys all for joining this. This was a great session. Chris, thanks for an amazing talk. I hope everybody got a ton of value out of this. And we're around, so hit us up, follow us on LinkedIn, participate in the data community. We'd love to see all you guys there.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.